episode of the Haptics podcast. I'm Brian from Sense Club, and I'm joined by the Haptics crew, Manu from Unity, Eric from Razer, and Ashley from Titan Haptics. The Haptics Club is a team of people that have a passion for haptics, and our goal is to raise awareness of the amazing tech and people in haptics and to foster interesting discussions on the subject. Speaking of that, right now we're joined by Pedro, who's an assistant professor at the University of Chicago and lead of the Human Computer Integration Lab in the Department of Computer Science. He's published over 30 papers as ACM, CHI, and UIST. His work has been captured by the MIT Technology Review, Discovery Channel, Wired, and New York Times. Quite a track record. There's much to learn and talk about, and we'll divide the hour with a 5-minute intro, then dive into the area of expertise, and then the future of haptics. We will, of course, cover challenges, opportunities of the haptics industry. Around the 45-minute mark, we stop the recording and open up the floor to the audience questions, so be ready. To anyone listening to our podcast, you're missing out. Be sure to visit thehapticsclub.com and sign up for a newsletter so you don't miss the next live chat, which is next week. Last but not least, we wouldn't be able to be here without our sponsors like the Haptics Industry Forum, a haptics association which was created to streamline haptic standards and adoption, foster collaboration, and increase market awareness. So that's it for the intro. Let's talk haptics. Ashley, floor is yours.
All right. Thank you so much for being here. I'm super excited. Just to kind of get us rolling, Pedro, can you tell us just a little bit about your background so listeners can have a better idea of like what you're up to and what you've been doing?
Yeah, what a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks for the intro. My background, well, I'm currently a computer scientist, and kind of that's what I've been most of my life, I guess. I've done a few other things in between, like being a musician and other stuff, but mostly I spend my time here at the Department of Computer Science at the University of Chicago. This is actually my office where we're talking now. And I lead a group, as Brian was saying, called the Human Computer Integration Group. And so we do research on all kinds of things, haptics being one of the primary ways we like to explore our work. So I work in the field of human-computer interaction, meaning like how do people interact with computers? And within that, I'm just really excited to see how we're going to interact with virtual worlds and virtual universities. And so a lot of that, in my opinion, has to do with the sense of haptics. It's kind of weird for us to imagine interacting in virtual worlds without, using our bodies, without feeling things. And so that's, I think, really where haptics come into play. I studied computer science for quite a while. I did it as an undergrad in Lisbon. That's where I'm from. And then I went to Berlin to work with Patrick Bowdish, who's really an amazing person and was my PhD mentor at the time. And after that, I came here to the University of Chicago and I started my own group.
That's awesome. Why haptics in just at all? Like, not many people know about the field of haptics, but you've become a pioneer in it. Like, what drove you to be in haptics and not a rock star?
I wouldn't say that. You guys have a lot of people here that are the true pioneers. I remember listening to the episode with Ed and many others. Like those people are just really the ones that inspired me to get into it. I would say I kind of fell into haptics. It was not a thing that I thought I would be doing. When I started my PhD, I was working on things like multi-touch and how to get, smartphones and other surfaces that have touch technology to be more expressive. I did things like trying to figure out what part of your body is like contacting the surface. Is it your knuckle? Is it your finger pad? Is it your nail? Things like that. But as I was starting to explore new technologies, I bumped into a technology for medical rehabilitation called electrical muscle stimulation, the type of thing that you might experience in your doctor. Or maybe like we were talking earlier about maybe someone broke their bones, skiing. And if something happens like that, one of the things that your doctor might, recommend to you is that while you're inside of the cast and recuperating, your bone is growing, they might put electrodes on your muscles and stimulate your muscles even inside of the cast to give you kind of a feel for how your muscles should be continuously moving and not atrophying, right? Not sort of like losing their tension. And so I fell into that technology and I was like, wow, this could really change the way we interact with computer systems if the computer could kind of tell my muscles what to do. It could revolutionize learning, could revolutionize other things. And when I started playing around with that idea of electrical muscle stimulation, I started noticing that what I was doing was haptics. So that's the first time I realized, well, if I'm moving my body through a computer, I'm kind of creating what we here in this group would call a force feedback device, right? A device that can move your body to, for example, to show you how to play the piano or whatever it is that you're trying to do. And through that, I started reading up, on the history of it. And that's how I found people like Ed Colgate and many others you guys had here on the podcast. And started reading up their work and realizing exactly what kind of haptics was I interested in what would be my contribution to haptics. And so that's more or less how I found haptics. I never thought I would be a haptics person, when I was 18 or something like that. I didn't even know what haptics was.
That's awesome. Yeah, what a haptic stance. That's a great introduction. I will carry the baton to my coworker Manu, who will dive deeper into the area of expertise. Manu, please.
Thanks, Pedro, and thanks, Ashley. So we have a first question for the area of expertise, which will be, what's one project that you've worked on in haptics that truly captured your imagination, and why did it stand out to you amongst all the other fascinating studies you've conducted?
That's really hard. Got to make me choose one, and my students will be sad if I don't pick theirs. I'm going to pick one of my PhD projects just to not get my students to fight. But no, I'm joking. Just because I think it's more telling of the story of it. I think it's a hard one, because somebody was saying in the chat of Fortnite++. That's one of the projects I like the most. But I'm going to pick another one. I'm going to pick a project that I did more directly related to force feedback and haptics that has no short name except we sometimes call it VR walls. But the long title is something like, I don't know, giving weight and forces to walls and other heavy objects in virtual reality. What we were trying to figure out there is, it was a really interesting time as well, because we were just in this cusp of new VR, right? This maybe was about 2016 or 14, something, when I started working on that project. So we had the first couple of versions of the Oculus Rift, and people were very excited to have a cheap VR headset. When I started my undergraduate, I remember VR headsets was very expensive. Like the lab that I worked in Portugal had one headset, and it was like, please don't break it, be very careful. And then all of a sudden, just a few years later, we could buy the Oculus Rift for just a couple of $100, and that was very affordable, and lots of makers and lots of early sort of artists in VR started getting excited about that. And so I had that headset flying around in the lab, and I started wondering to myself, well, could I start to feel the physicality of these worlds? Could I actually get immersed, my body immersed on these worlds, and not just my eyes? It felt already very realistic. I know we've come a long way with VR headsets. The resolution of the displays has quadrupled since then. But what I saw the first time I tried that demo was already like visually realistic, but I remember putting my hands out and being like, I see, this is just ghosts. I can't feel anything. And again, I was starting to read the literature and realize, well, people have solved that problem before. They would attach these giant exoskeleton types of devices to your body, and they can use motors to move your body. And so when you're putting your hand through a wall in VR, the motor would kick back at you and say, hey, you can't penetrate, and sort of stop your hand right in midair. That sounded perfect to me. And so my next question was like, why don't we have an exoskeleton in our lab? I remember looking at my advisor and being like, we don't have one. And he's like, no, it's really, really expensive. It's like a really strange kind of device. And the more I read the literature of those devices, the more I realized that they're amazing, but they're sort of at odds with how we experience VR today. We're kind of thinking always, and especially now with mixed reality, we're always thinking of like experiences on the go. There's no cables. The thing works on battery. My hands are free. I don't even need like the base stations anymore for tracking my body. This just got so crazy in the last years, right? The fact that the headsets just track inside out. It's all very beautiful, except you don't have haptics. And if the price to pay for haptics is to wear like a giant exoskeleton or a motion platform that you cannot move around freely, that seems like a really big ask for users. And so I started wondering, like, was there another way to think of force feedback and large scale haptics, like really like I can't put my hand through the wall type of haptics that did not require like a large room infrastructure with big motors and big batteries and all that. And that's how I got into that electrical muscle stimulation. I thought of it as a way to make very small haptic devices, the kind that could provide a really large force, but it's sort of a trick. It's actually just using your own muscles. It sends electrical impulse. Your muscle recoils when it touches the wall, and you think you can't penetrate the wall, but the reality is more like you're just tricking yourself, and it's your own muscles that you're fighting against. And so that's why I really like that project, because it's like, oh, here's a really strange way to think of a haptic device. It's your own body. And it took us a while to make it reality, and took us a while to understand even what we were saying. But I really like that one if I had to pick one.
I love that. Did you get electrocuted during the testing?
Oh, many times.
I love it. I'm wondering, kind of a side question to that, but there is a lot of haptics illusion happening now to kind of create those effects where you will see your hands in VR, but they will be mapped to you, and obviously your real hands go through the wall because it's not there, but your virtual hand doesn't. And just that trick already does it for some people. Is that something that was in combination of what you were doing, or it was strictly just electronic?
No, you're completely right, Manu. Like, we were using that trick on top of everything else we were doing. Yes. And that trick is really, really powerful, right? I mean, our visual sense, I'm here saying that haptics is super important, and it is. Especially, we'll talk later about training and physical skills. I mean, that's where haptics is just nuts. You can't do anything just looking at it. But with things like that, like I'm walking to a wall and I'm touching it, I'm locating an object in the room and I'm going to grasp it. You're completely right. Like, the visual sense is so overwhelming that if you just stop the hands at the right place, that plays a huge role. But the happy part of that study is that you were right. The baseline condition was that one. So in all conditions, there was this technique that we sometimes call the proprioceptive remapping, or some people call it differently, haptic retargeting, lots of different names. It's just this idea that your virtual hand behaves physically even if your real hand is in the wrong place. But the moment we added the haptics with the muscle stimulation, people were by far, significantly thinking it was more realistic. Objects felt heavier. The whole environment felt more immersive to them, more enjoyable. Lots of kind of other benefits as well on top of that technique.
Awesome. I love you just gave like two amazing keys. So I'm just going to re-say it. Proprioceptive remapping and haptic retargeting. I love this. It sounds exactly what it is when I hear it. Okay, another question that is very similar, but I do want to hear what are your thoughts. Is there anything that was surprising as an experience that caught you off guard in all of those studies?
Yeah, I mean, this really goes back to like what the purpose of haptics is in VR and stuff like that. But I actually started that project very early in my PhD. I don't know anymore because my memory is never really great, but it might have been even my first project in the lab or second project. And then it didn't really work. That was the kind of interesting thing. So first thing I did was, if your hand would stay on the wall, for as long as your hand would stay on the wall, I would apply the counterforce. So I'd contract the muscle opposing to the one you're moving with to move your hand to the wall. And that meant that if your hand stayed on the wall for like 3 minutes, for a solid 3 minutes, I would be pushing with the electrical muscle stimulation. And that felt just wrong. I remember showing it to my advisor and to a bunch of other people in the room. And they were like, yeah, force is amazing. The amount of force is really impressive, but it just doesn't feel realistic because, I feel all these tingling sensations from the electrical muscle stimulation. I also feel a pushing force and like walls push in a very specific way, and it feels kind of strange, and etc. And so I kind of shelved that project for a little bit, and I went to work on another thing where we were trying to create the sensation of like being punched or punching back in virtual reality. So for virtual reality sports, we were trying to create these sensations of force. But those forces in sports are all very quick. Like if you punch a box or if you kick a football, it's like for 300 milliseconds, you feel the recoil of the ball hitting you, and that's it. And it was an amazing result. So again, we were using the same thing that you were referring to. We were using the muscle stimulation. But participants would just like buy this to a level that it was even kind of creepy. There was one study where we had them watch a video of someone, punching their arms in a kind of like a boxing simulator. And one participant one time even like lifted the headset up and thought we were really punching their arms. And, we weren't. We didn't have any RB for that kind of stuff. It was just a video, and it was just a muscle stimulation and another haptic device. But they were really immersed. And so I started asking myself, why did it work so well on that project and didn't work so well on the wall stuff? And so it turned out to be that VR is a really difficult space where emulating the physical world, like being purely perfect with real world physics, is a really tall order. But it's like video games. If you're self-consistent if you're immersed, like you will believe in what you're watching. We all go to the movies and we're like super enthusiastic and we cry in the movies, although we know we're in a seat in a theater, but we're still crying with a character because everything makes sense in that narrative. And so we get triggered. And so the solution we did with the walls was actually to explore what kind of walls should we have. And it turned out that we tried to, we presented people with like a really realistic wall. It's made of wood and it sounds like wood when you touch it. And we showed them like a hyper non-realistic wall, but very self-consistent that had electrical sparkles like a sci-fi wall coming on. And when we touch it, you would hear when there was a white flash to distract you and all kinds of things. And they loved that one. That's the one they thought it was immersive. And it wasn't realistically in the physical way, but it was consistent with their experience. And so turns out there was a number of, honestly, design tricks to be done to make the haptics feel really good. And I'm excited because when I look at today's haptics, everybody's excited about PS5 controller and things like that. Those aren't realistic haptics as much as they're like extremely well-designed haptics. That's, I think, what's going to be successful. It's just experiences that you're like, wow, this is so exciting in the game. It's not like this is the right frequency that in the world when I touch, a corrugated cardboard, what I feel, but like, wow, this in the game makes a lot of sense. It's a high frequency, and I expected a high frequency in the game. And so that was a surprising insight for me because this was mostly my advisor that kind of solved the problem by saying we got to design rather than engineer, because I was like, no, I'm going to engineer like this physical wall that is going to be perfect. And it was sort of a nice inside moment, like, let's see why it doesn't work. Yeah.
This is so important. Oh, thank you for this answer. I relate to this a lot because I realized that I was trying for so long to try to replicate the real world when in fact you have the power to just create something completely new and your brain accepts it for what it is. And it's actually funnier almost to create sci-fi haptics than really trying to recreate what is exactly nature. So thank you for that. And I love that you said that it's sometimes you need to put your designer hat and that the engineer,
for sure.
Brian and I
always say this as like, oh, I don't care about realism, but there are places to emulate and there's places to just create something different. I was mentioning, like, I think if you're doing training and the goal of that VR is to learn something, that then you take the headset off and you go and you truly like learn, and now you can operate in the real world with the skills you just learned. Well, then by all means, you gotta be hyper physical. But if it's like painting in VR, then it's like tilt brush, and it doesn't have to be the physical painting. But if it's the goal of then going to paint in the real world, then it has to be hyper realistic. Yeah.
Awesome. For those of us that are listening to this later, the advantage of being live with us is that you can live comment. I'm going to read a comment from our chat on Zoom. Dan Shore, which we had the honor of having on the group actually in the past. Thank you for being there, Dan. And he's saying, when you have already posed belief, it's easier to buy the entirety of the experience, which is exactly what you're saying, Pedro. And I love this. So your track record shows many experiments that required thinking out of the box. What, in your opinion, makes a great idea for a study? And can you share with us the thought process that goes into creating novel and innovative ideas in your research?
That's a really tough question.
We're known for that. We briefed you.
I think the honest answer is that we also just try a lot of stuff in the lab. We're just very curious about different things, and we keep trying. I think the particular taste that our ideas have, or the particular like thing that maybe makes you call them innovative, is that we try to kind of look at what we have and really like, why don't we have this other thing, right? So for example, that question with the VR walls is like, why don't I have an exoskeleton with me right now? And we try to go there, and there's many ways to get blocked very rapidly. You could say, well, economically, it's not viable to do this muscle stimulation, and there's so many calibration problems, and there's so much we don't know about the anatomy of the body. We can't stimulate the muscles as precisely as an exoskeleton. But I think for a moment we say, like, let's just see how much of that we can solve, how much of that might be solved in the future, and just let's pause our disbelief for a second and just explore what would happen if we had that. And sometimes we try things in the lab, pausing the disbelief, and we try and like, yeah, that's why it doesn't work. Or sometimes like, oh, that's interesting. It sounded crazy, the idea of applying, I don't know, chemicals to generate haptics. But now we tried it, and there's a couple of ways this could actually make sense, and here are a bunch of roadmaps that we could solve, and here's some roadblocks that people could try to solve, either us or our colleagues in the field or in industry. And so I think it goes very often of just starting to believe in one idea and asking ourselves, could this happen, and what would be required to make this happen? And sometimes the questions, as you said, are just more study driven, where we're like, I don't know if this would work, like an illusion. So we try with a bunch of people, didn't work, or it worked. Sometimes it's an engineering question. I wonder if it's possible if this device was super lightweight and if it would fold in this way. I wonder, let's try it out. And we try to engineer it and so forth, so forth. But it often starts with some kind of what if question. And with our, maybe that's the mad scientist part, ability to like just say, let's pretend this is not a huge drama, because it is. There's so many problems and this is not going to work. But let's pretend for a second it wouldn't be, and then we try it. Yeah.
I see Ashley cheering the
Ashley's happy with that.
Mad scientist. Yes.
She wants.
But you know what? I think it's beautiful what you're saying, is that allowing yourself to be surprised, in a sense, right? And we hear it in the term haptician, like for the haptic designers, because there's a little bit of magic in that world. And
Absolutely.
To me, it's like you just described the Bob Ross haptic version of Bob Ross, where it's like, those are happy little accidents. I didn't intend those three to be on the final paintings, but I was okay and open to have them. And now I look at the full composition and it makes sense. So by coming in with a bigger open brain, then you allow yourself for those discoveries. So thanks for that. Okay, next question. As an expert in the field of haptics, what improvements do you believe can be made by current market players in their commercially available products?
What would be the example of a market player? I just want to make sure I get the question.
I don't want to name someone specific. Ashley, do you want to help me with that?
Yeah, maybe we can angle it as in, what kind of technologies, I'll take it slightly different angle. What kind of technologies do you think would be coming out of like your labs that could be used maybe next, or like the closest to being like a commercialized product? That way we don't have to name someone. I get you.
Yeah. I feel like the stuff we work on is a little experimental, and I don't know when it would come out and in which forms. I think some of the stuff we do is kind of closer to reality, or closer to a marketable reality, or at least someone could take it and say, like, now I will engineer this for 10 years to make it robust, which is really a amazing skill set that we don't have in my lab. And I keep telling that to my students. It's just unbelievable, the sort of work that is required to take something that looks really cool in a research video and then be like, I'm going to make this into a product. I mean, that's unbelievable. But one of the things we've been doing in the most recent years, maybe a year or two, is to ask ourselves the question, if this whole, and maybe I'm going to get provocative here, but if this whole glove thing is the right direction for haptics. And so I personally think it's not the right direction for augmented reality or mixed reality haptics. I think it's kind of a really tall order to say you can feel augmented reality if you put on a glove, but now you have to take out the glove every single time you want to touch something real. If you want to type on your keyboard, remove the glove, because you're not going to have enough dexterity to do that. And I think that's fine for VR. I think gloves in VR makes 100% sense, because when you enter in the VR world, you're in a black box, everything is rendered, everything is virtualized. So no problem of having gloves, except perhaps when you put on the VR headset. That's kind of tough, because when you put on the headset and take it off, you actually need quite a little bit of dexterity. So awesome. And, Brian, keep on with the glove stuff. But
thank you. Can totally relate.
But augmented reality, I feel like it's a tall order, because you're like, I want to touch virtual things, and the split second after I'm going to type my keyboard, and the split second after I'm shaking someone's hands, and so forth. It's like a high multiplexing world where you're never in one or the other. You're in both realities at the same time. That's why I think that the term mix is a really good term. And so in the last years, we've been trying to propose haptic ways to feel something in your skin without covering up the skin, which, at first, when I first had that thought, it just seemed like a paradox. I was like, maybe I shouldn't drag my students into something that already looks wrong just from a logical, and I say this word and it's like, okay, how are you going to touch something if you're not there on top of that part of the skin? But turns out there are ways. And so, for example, one of the works that I think is closer to something that, like you were asking, Ashley, could potentially be turned into something, revolutionary for industry with lots of work on top, is a work by my student Shenyuan Tang. She made a device that allows you to feel, touch, and mixed reality, but the device kind of like folds and unfolds depending on whether you're touching something virtual or you're touching something real. So if you're touching something real, the device is kind of like in a transformer state, kind of goes back and it's on top of your fingernail. And then if I'm about to touch something real, it unfolds, slaps my finger pad. I feel realistic touch. It's impressive because it actually does pressure. It also has an LRA, so it can vibrate at different frequencies in there and could do sort of a decent level of realism. And then again, I take my finger away from that virtual object that I'm contacting. And again, the whole thing unfolds and goes back to the nail.
It has to do the juju. If not, it's not.
It has to do the juju. And it takes 90 milliseconds, which is, I thought it was really impressive to do juju because I initially thought it was going to take a long time to fold and unfold. But, you know, Shenyuan is a real engineer. And so he was able to do that really fast. So I thought that was, and I don't know if I was in industry, you know, if I would solve it with a mechanical device, because I know how hard it is to like build haptic stuff, and then you're putting a motor in there and the thing moves. It's like, okay, this is gonna get stuck somewhere, it's gonna break. But I think this idea, like you were saying, I think this idea will show up eventually, or hopefully will inspire someone. The idea that maybe, and this goes back to the realism thing too, maybe we don't need the hyper realism. If that implies sacrificing like portability, touching real things, maybe we can find another type of approach that allows me to feel the virtual decently and the real optimally, rather than having to like glove on, glove off, and have both perfect, which is what the gloves do. They're amazing. Like with an actuator inside the finger pad, like you can render very realistic things, like really, really, really impressive, better than what we have for sure. But
thank you, Pedro. For oh yeah, no, continue.
But sacrificing. No, that was it.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you for that answer. That was lovely. Can totally relate to the challenges you're putting up there. So one thing I also think is unique about your research is that for all those different projects you're doing, the equipment that you build yourself, all the haptic interfaces, a lot of building and tinkering. And I'm sure that many listeners that are listening right now are also experts or hobbyists building their own setups. And I was wondering, do you have any advice for anyone that wants to get into building their own haptic devices themselves?
That's an awesome question. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's a really beautiful space we inhabit today where there's lots of ways to get into this without being like a hardware engineer. Just for context, maybe that inspires someone listening out there. I did study computer science, but that means I never had like a really electronics course or anything like that. So I've never studied electrical engineering my whole life. I have no diplomas on the wall that would classify me as a capable person in the electrical space or circuit design space. And I think that's one of the remarkable things in the world we live today. Like you can find a lot of information online and you can really learn from other experts who decided to share their knowledge. There's so many open source platforms for microcontrollers and Arduinos and things like that. And that's kind of what we do in the lab. You know, we try to leverage all that stuff to get us a little bit of a kickstart. Otherwise, we would, you know, be trying to design our own microcontroller and like sending it off to a fab somewhere, and we haven't even done anything. But because there's so much kind of potential out there and so many resources, we can, even without all of us being electrical engineers, we can kind of get our head started really fast with even with something as difficult as haptics that involves also like learning about the actuators and so forth. But luckily, a lot of companies even sell haptic actuators not for a lot of money, right? You can buy an LRA these days for super cheap and start playing with that. And you can make your own sort of gloves and things like that from Arduinos and other components that are not extremely hard to work with. When I started as like a high school person being interested in like electronics, I remember giving up because the microcontroller stuff was so hard to use. Had to buy the special programmers, and it would only work on a very specific kind of license that the manufacturer of the microcontroller would sell. And I tried to like program it, but it wasn't the right thing. There was no USB microcontrollers at all. And I was like, this microcontroller stuff is hard. I'll just do analog electronics instead, which now it seems funny to say that because analog became really hard these days. But it really flipped. It's so beautiful to get into these things. I teach students here at the university that have zero background in electronics, how to do things. And by the end of 9 weeks, they're doing stuff as cool as our devices. You know, they make a motor vibrate. It's a wearable form factor, works on battery, has Wi-Fi, has Bluetooth. It's like, wow, this is so amazing these days how you can get into this stuff really, really fast.
Yeah, you're completely right. I think it's worth to do a shout out to all the open source projects online as well. It's always it's so inspiring to see all the work that's available, and being able to build along makes it even better.
Amazing.
So I think after the area of expertise, it's time to dive into the future of haptics, which is, the favorite area of most of us. We tend to go a little crazy or realistic, whatever you feel like, Pedro, but we're wondering, how do you see haptics evolve in the coming 5 to 10 years?
That's the timeline I'm bad at, 5-10 years, because those are real predictions. In 10 years, you guys are like calling me like, hey, you said I work very well in the 100 years when I'm not here anymore. Like, yeah, it's gonna work. I think 5 to 10 years is a tough prediction, because it also depends so much on what happens in industry and mainstream adoption, right? This is an exciting period. VR did well in the last years and brought haptics to the foreground, in my opinion. I think a lot of haptics researchers, if they're not admitting that, they're hiding a little bit in their vests, because the reality is haptics is so mainstream these days in research because of VR. I mean, I really give credit to VR and AR for pushing haptics to the foreground. But at the same time, now we have these things, right? Like, Titan and other companies doing like very interesting kinds of haptics that have no relationship necessarily, or like no mandatorily just a VR type of haptics. That's really, really exciting. And people coming to me after class being like, I have a PS5 and I just tried this thing, tell me more. And I was like, I don't have a PS5, you tell me more. And so I think seeing that go into the mainstream is really, really exciting. A student was telling me after class that they read a post where, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, but some Reddit post where folks were debating, if your Apple Watch would live for 24 hours more, but you would lose the haptic engine in there, would you like that or not? And it was overwhelmingly no. And apparently Reddit posts are always, people are always polarized. So it's always 50-50. This was 99% or something like that. People were like, no, I want this. Is one of my favorite ideas about this Apple Watch is that I have this haptic engine and it does all these cool things and it vibrates in all these cool ways. And so I think having people in the mainstream relating to haptics and feeling like haptics is important gives me a sense of like, maybe in the next 5-10 years, we'll have really crazy stuff. And then back to your question, I think really crazy stuff could be, I hope we will have ways to engage with learning that are haptics. Right now, people will like, I want to learn ukulele. And they go to YouTube videos and they have an amazing experience. But there's always this difficulty where your eyes see something, but you have to translate it into physical poses and to physical feelings, right? How should I feel? How much force do I put on the strings and how do I strum it? I hope that and this is where I think gloves is gonna play a good role in the learning stuff. I'll have some kind of gloves that I put on. I buy it at Target and I go and I download the ukulele program and I start having assistance to learning these things. And they don't have to do everything for me. They don't have to be completely force feedback and move my fingers like the stuff that I'm doing. But like maybe they vibrate on the right place. Maybe they direct my fingers slightly with asymmetric vibrations to be on the right chord or to be on the right string. I think that's going to be like really transformative, and people are really going to appreciate having a haptic experience like that. And then I think the VR AR is going to benefit a lot from haptics. I think games will by default have amazing haptics experiences. I'd be surprised if that's not the case. We're going to feel lots of stuff, and maybe that will come first with gloves, and then later we'll figure out how to also do that for AR without gloves. But I wouldn't be surprised if somebody cracks the code and in the next 10 years we have like a really amazing haptic device that we can just buy together with a VR headset.
Thank you, Pedro, for that answer. That's awesome. So yeah, 5 to 10 years is a difficult question you mentioned. So the 100 years, the sci-fi stuff, if that's easier, what do you think about that?
In the 100 years, everything. I mean, exponential progress is really insane to play with 100 years, right? 100 years ago, I don't even know what we didn't have, like nothing that would enable our conversation to happen remotely. So I do think in 100 years, we will be integrated with computers in a very, very different way. That was sort of like, we will look back and feel like wearables and smartphones are kind of like a really, this is so so clunky and so disconnected from my body. So I think people will have a much more intimate interaction with technology. And I think that's for the better. It's very easy to be dystopian with stuff like that, but I actually also think will be for the better. I think right now, all the interactions we have that are mediated through technology feel very actually disembodied. Like you go to social VR, your body's not very involved. We are on Zoom. I can barely get the body language and the sort of special things that make us all humans. But I think it would be really important if when we're communicating remotely, I can also feel what you feel and so forth, so forth. So I think if you're having a remote conversation with someone in the future and it's your doctor and you say, this is the type of pain that I feel, it immediately gets transferred to the other side and they're like, feel it in their body and they say, I see what you mean, it's that. Or if you're working out on Zoom with your trainer or something like that and you say, I can't do the movement very well, they sort of like momentarily with your consent, hijack your body, take control, and they correct your pose, and this is what happens. And I think all those devices, in order for that to happen, they'll be extremely small, extremely integrated with your body. In 100 years, I don't even know. They might even be crazy kinds of devices we can't predict now. But I think we'll have that very fluid kind of intimate interaction with computers, which right now it's still very much I click, computer does, and I go back. It's a lot of turn taking. I think that will disappear very rapidly.
This was amazing. Thank you, Pedro.
Well, we'll see in 100 years.
Awesome. So we like to, give you the floor again. Just is there like a tip? Is there some advice that you want to share with the audience? Let's start there, and then we'll give you an opportunity to let people know, like, where can they find more about what you guys are working on? All these amazing experiments, technologies, experiments, and fun mad science stuff.
Yeah. A tip. This is hard. We were talking about that before we started. I think it's interesting to think about like what kind of contribution each individual wants to have to the field of haptics. And I want to emphasize that I think everything is really important, because we're talking here a little bit about my perspective, which I have this luxury because I'm in a research lab to sort of be a little bit on the future side and kind of use technologies that I don't even know momentarily if they make any sense or they're viable and so forth. But that's really just one way of being and being a haptics person. It's like, okay, in 50 years, what could we have? Another really, really important way, perhaps more important even, because you advance the field immediately, is to say, I want to put out a device, or I want to engineer a better actuator, or I want to design, like we were talking to hapticians, people that design haptics. I want to do that work. And that's extra important as well. And so I think it's kind of a cool way to be in the haptic space, because there's spaces in the world that don't have this flexibility. Either today everything is done and you can only be in the future, or the other way around, there is no future yet and you can only be in the very fundamental, I'm kind of trying to figure out the quantum mechanics of this device. In haptics is very, very fluid. You can really be in any of these spaces. So I think you can almost like match your personality to the thing you want to work on. Is like, I really want to optimize this actuator. Awesome. Like, we need that. We need that right now. All these actuators are super power hungry. Can you optimize them? Then, Apple is going to hire you tomorrow to optimize their haptic something. Or you're like, well, I'm really like more like an artist. I don't want to, be bounded by the constraints of today. Well, great. We need a lot of devices for the future, and companies need inspiration for what they might be building in the next 5 to 10 years, like you were saying, Brian. And so, yes, you can work on that sort of fringe of haptics, and that's very, very welcome too. So I think that's my advice, is kind of, you can really pick your adventure in haptics, and it's a luxury to be in a space like that. There's other spaces that are so saturated and don't offer that flexibility. And then where to find our stuff, right?
Yep.
I'd say the easiest way to find our stuff is to search it on your favorite search engine, which seems like it's now becoming ChatGPT. And I'm sure you would say that you go, here's the lab URL, which is lablab.plopes with an S, so PLOPES.org. Or you could just Google Human Computer Integration Lab and you'll find our lab website. We try to, going back to Brian's point about open source, we try to open source almost everything we do in the lab. if it's a haptic device, most of the circuits, most of the even 3D prints and things like that have been open sourced. If it's a study, we tried the best of our knowledge to kind of like share even like the study script. Here's the Unity scene we used, to test out, and this was where people were immersed. And occasionally we get emails from people that try to replicate those studies or use them in new ways. Or like just the other day, we learned someone at NASA is using our muscle stimulation. I thought that was kind of cool. I have no idea what they're doing with it, but we thought that was kind of nice. And so we try to share that. So if you go to that URL, you can find the papers, and the videos are all on YouTube links. But I think if you're a person that wants to build and remix things, or an artist that just even just like, I'm an artist and I like that weird VR scene you guys use on the Chemical Haptics project, you can just rip them off and use it on your own stuff. We're very excited if you do that.
Fantastic. Oh, that's great. Love that so much. So definitely check it out. So many amazing projects to just like immerse yourself in, get inspired by. But Pedro, thank you so much for joining us. This has been an amazing episode. I think we've covered a lot of different areas, a great convo on like design, experimentation, and really like the joy of exploration. I think that's one thing I really appreciate about this conversation is like you just bring so much like light to it, and you make it accessible, which is amazing. So also a special thanks. We all have coffees. We are able to do this club because we have a sponsor, Haptics Industry Forum, an association that was created to streamline haptic standards and adoption. We rising tides help all ships. And for anyone listening, of course, check out the hapticsclub.com. That's where you'll find our next episodes. We're also on LinkedIn, Twitter. And if you want to listen to our podcast, it's Spotify. We're on Apple Podcasts, but I'll leave it there. Thank you so much for listening. We appreciate you, and stay curious, and we'll see you at the next episode.
Thanks for having me. This was awesome.
Beautiful. All right.